In Module 5, we are going to talk about conducting psychological research. And the questions we are going to answer in this module are: what research methods do psychologists use? So there are various research methodologies that scientists can use, meaning you may do a survey, you may do an interview, you may do naturalistic observation, you may do a case study, or you may do an experiment, which is a very controlled type of research methodology that we'll talk about also in this module. The second module that we are going to talk about is, or the second question, excuse me, that we are going to talk about in this module is: how do psychologists establish cause and effect relationships in research studies? When we discuss the research methodology of doing correlational research, the main thing that we're going to talk about to keep in mind is correlation does not mean causation. Just because there is a relationship between two variables does not mean that one caused the other. And so the second question that we're answering here in Module 5 is: how do psychologists actually conduct the cause and effect relationship to show the two variables are related to each other, meaning that one caused the other one? Okay, so let's get started with Module 5. And the first thing we're going to talk about is conducting psychological research. Conducting psychological research. First of all, let's just give a basic definition for research. It is a systematic inquiry aimed at the discovery of new knowledge, and it is a central ingredient of the scientific method in psychology. As I've mentioned previously, what makes psychology a science, just like your other sciences, is that we use the scientific method in conducting our research. And so in doing that, we follow that. If you remember the optic R that we talked about in Module 4, what we are going to do is we're going to talk about how we go about using that scientific method in the research that we conduct. It also provides the key to understanding the accuracy of the hypotheses and theories. Once you come about with a theory and you state your hypothesis based on your theory, you have to make sure that the results you get are actually supporting that hypothesis that is based on the theory. And this may seem somewhat common sense to a lot of you, but there is some poor research that's done, and the results that are found do not actually support the hypothesis. And in setting up your research in the beginning, you are doing so to make sure that the research that you're conducting is going to support your hypothesis, or it is going to deal with your hypothesis. Okay, so let's start out talking about the various types of research methodology that you could use in conducting a research. We're going to talk about this over the next couple of slides, the various types of studies that you could run. The first one is what is called archival research. And of course, whenever you think about archival, you think about archives, right? If you go into the archives section of a library, you go into a section that talks about history, past history on a town, past history about an organization, things like that. So with archival research, you're using existing data that's already been collected to examine and test your hypothesis. So you are not necessarily going out and collecting data from participants, so to speak, but you are using data that has already been collected. And then you are going to try and use that data to run run a study to find out if it supports your hypothesis. So the various types of archival research that you could use could be census documents. Every 10 years, the United States does a U.S. Census, and each individual in the United States who is, let's say, how do I want to say this? Who is maybe a voting individual who can vote in the United States, who is I don't know the word I'm trying to look at, someone who is documented in the United States, they will complete the U.S. Census. And that census you get a ton of information from the census, not only who is living in your household, how old the people are in the household, how much money, the education level, the race, the religion, the politics, all of that information is collected in the U.S. Census. Another type of archival research you could use is college records. You could also use online databases. And then the fourth type of archival research would be newspaper clippings. So all four of these have a lot of data within each of them that you could use in conducting your study to support your hypothesis. So we have both an advantage and a disadvantage to doing archival research. The advantage is that it is inexpensive, right? It's not going to cost you anything to go online to an online database and look at information. It's not going to cost you anything to look up the U.S. Census information for your community or for, different schools in your district or whatever it is. It's not going to cost you anything to look up newspaper clippings. So it is a very inexpensive way to do research. The disadvantage is that the data may not be in a form that allows the researcher to test the hypothesis fully. And also, another disadvantage is that the information could be incomplete or it could have been collected haphazardly. You are relying on this archival research to be correct, to have hopefully been ethically collected, but sometimes that is not always the case. Not everyone in society knows about the rules of collecting data. We in psychology do because we do a lot of research, but you would have to hope that maybe they collected it correctly, but maybe some of it is incomplete. Maybe it wasn't collected in the most proper way and it was collected haphazardly. So you have to keep that in mind if you are choosing to use archival research in collecting your data for your study. A second type of methodology used would be naturalistic observation. And this is where a researcher observes some sort of environment where there is naturally occurring behavior. It does not control or make any change in the situation. So significantly, the researcher simply records what occurs. You cannot control anything about the environment. You do not want the people in that environment to know that they are being observed. Sometimes if individuals know they are being observed and know they are being watched, then they may not behave in the same way that they naturally would. So in doing naturalistic observation, you cannot let individuals know that you're conducting research on them. It just has to be where you go out and you become one of the members of that group. And in the same time, you're actually conducting research on them. A lot of anthropologists use naturalistic observation when they're collecting their data. A very well-known scientific anthropologist is Jane Goodall. She spent the majority of her life living in the jungle among primates so that she could conduct collect research on that primate behavior. I actually saw Jane Goodall speak one time when I was a student at Kansas State University. And in doing so, you could tell that she spent a lot of time amongst primates and not really too much time among humans. She was much more comfortable probably around primates than what she was around humans. That's not to say she wasn't a good speaker, but you could just tell that she had spent a lot of time not among humans, but among, non-human animals. So again, with naturalistic observation, there is both advantages and disadvantages to doing this type of research. The advantage is that you obtain a sample of what people do in their natural habitat. The disadvantage is that you do not have any control over what happens while you are conducting that research. Because you do not want the individuals to know that you're conducting research on them. So you lose a lot of control in doing that. So you have both an advantage where you're going to get really true behavior, but a disadvantage in that you don't know what type of behaviors you're necessarily going to get. You lose a lot of control in that. A third type of methodology would be survey research. And I'm sure probably the majority of you have taken part in a survey at some point in time in your lives, whether that be at the end of the semester and you're taking part in an evaluation of the course and of the instructor. So that is survey types of research. So it is where people are chosen to represent a larger population, and they are asked a series of questions about their behavior, about their thoughts, or about their attitudes. So usually with survey research, you would do a Likert type of scale, right? So you would be asked on a scale of 1 to 10, how do you feel about this? Or how do you feel about that? With one being that you are not likely at all, or 10 being that you are very likely, right? So with survey research, you are being asked about your own thoughts and opinions. The advantage is that if the sample is actually representative, it makes it possible to infer how a larger group would respond. So we'll come back and we'll talk about this representative sample in just a little bit on an upcoming slide. But the people that you choose to fill out your survey should be chosen because they represent the larger population that you are not actually conducting research on. And then there are two disadvantages to doing survey research. One of those is that the results will be largely inconsequential if the sample is not representative. If you are looking at college freshmen, and you have a question, a hypothesis based on college freshmen, and then you send your survey out to everyone at the college, there may be a lot of people filling out that survey who are not college freshmen. Therefore, their answers are not representative of the overall population. So they're going to be inconsequential. They're not even going to matter. That's one disadvantage. A second disadvantage is that you're not sure if your participants are being truthful. You're hoping they are, but you have no way of knowing that if they're being truthful. The next type of methodology is the case study. The case study is an in-depth, intensive investigation of an individual or a small group of people. A lot of times a case study may be one individual that you're studying over an extended period of time. Maybe you want to study Johnny's behavior since the time he was diagnosed with schizophrenia to the time that he's been on medication for 10 years, right? So you're going to do a 10-year study on Johnny and his behavior. Maybe you're going to look at a group of individuals who are diagnosed with ADHD and you want to study their behavior in elementary school or their testing outcomes in elementary school. So you would start out with them in kindergarten and you would continue testing that group of individuals through 5th grade. So that is a case study. It might include psychological testing, which is where you have a carefully designed set of questions that is used to gain some insight into the personality of the individual or group. And again, you have advantages and disadvantages. The advantage of doing a case study is that it gives the individual, or it gives you some insight on ways that can improve your understanding of people in general. Now, that's not to say that the way Johnny behaves with schizophrenia is the way that every individual is going to behave with schizophrenia. But it's not possible for you to study all individuals, diagnosed with schizophrenia. So you are looking at how Johnny behaves, and if he is a representative sample, let's say, then it may improve your understanding of people in general who have schizophrenia. The disadvantage is that it's usually a very small sample, as we said, one individual or a small group of individuals, and that would make it impossible to make a valid generalization about the larger population. So again, I would not say that the way Johnny behaves is the way that all individuals with schizophrenia are going to behave. However, as the advantage says, is that it can give you some insight that can improve your understanding of people in general. However, you should not take your very small sample and say that it's the way that the overall population is going to behave. The next type of methodology is the correlational research. We're going to spend a couple of slides talking about correlational research. Now, in a math class previously in your schooling, you may have done correlations. We're not going to have you do any math in this course, but I'm going to talk about how correlational research, what that provides for you if you're using that type of research study. So with correlational research, you have, number one, you have variables. Variables are behaviors or events or other characteristics that can change or vary in some way. So perhaps you're talking about hair color or skin color or religion or race or political affiliation or socioeconomic status, education levels. Those are all variables that you could have in your study. Correlational research itself is the relationship between two sets of variables that are examined, and they're examined to determine whether or not they are associated or correlated. So whenever you hear the word correlation, you should be thinking about the word relationship. You're going to look at two variables and see if there is some sort of relationship between those two variables. However, you have to keep in mind that just because two variables are related, that does not mean that one caused the other. That's where you have that saying, correlation does not mean causation. So that is the disadvantage of doing correlational research. It cannot demonstrate a cause and effect relationship. Now, when you do correlational research, when you get around to analyzing your data, you are going to get a single digit, and that digit is called a correlation coefficient. And the correlation coefficient is going to tell you the strength and direction of the relationship between the two variables. And this correlation coefficient will be between positive 1.0 and negative 1.0. Now, the strength of the relationship is how close that number is to 1.0, regardless of the positive or negative, okay? Regardless of the positive or negative. The strength of the relationship is going to tell you how close that number is to 1.00. So a correlation of 0.89 is going to be much stronger than a correlation of 0.50 because 0.89 is closer to 1.0 than 0.59 is. The positive and negative will tell you about the direction that the correlation is going. So a positive correlation is the value of one variable as the value of one variable increases, so will the value of the other variable increase. So as you consume more calories, your weight will also increase, right? That's a positive correlation. As calories increase, weight increases. So the stronger the association, the closer the number will be to 1.0. So positive means that the variables are going in the same direction. However, you can also have a negative correlation. And that is as one variable increases, the other variable decreases. So perhaps as you exercise more, your weight is going to go down. The more you exercise, the less you weigh. So your variables are going in different directions. So again, the positive is that the variables are going in the same direction. The negative is that the variables are going in different directions. The strength of the relationship is how close the number is to 1.0. The positive and negative has nothing to do with the strength of the relationship. If there is no relationship whatsoever between your two variables, then that would be indicated by a value close to 0. If your correlation coefficient is 0.5, that shows there is little to no relationship between your two variables. If your correlation coefficient is 0.90, then you have a very strong relationship between your variables. Okay, the next slide that I'm going to show you is taken right from your textbook. So this slide is figure 1, and it is on page 38 in your textbook. And it's showing that it's looking at see if there's any correlation between television viewing programs that are aggressive and then high levels of aggressive behavior. So the possible cause in letter A is choosing to watch a television program that is highly aggressive. The potential result is high viewer aggression. And then the next one, the possible cause is high viewer aggression. The possible result is that they chose to watch a television program with high aggressive content. Now, a lot of times because we cannot determine a cause and effect relationship. Just because there is a relationship between watching violent TV and having violent behavior, there may be a correlation between those two things. However, you're not saying that violent TV causes violent behavior. There may actually be this third variable, and that is what you see in letter C. You may have someone who watches a lot of aggressive TV programs, and they themselves have high aggression. However, because these two are not in a cause and effect relationship, it may be that there is an unusually high energy level with those individuals. So again, as you can see down here below in this very last sentence, correlational findings do not permit us to determine causality. Correlation does not mean causation. Just because two variables are related does not mean that one caused the other. All right, let's move on to the last type of research methodology that you could use. This would be experimental research. And this is a lot of times what individuals think of when they think of conducting an experiment. But you have to remember that when you conduct an experiment, your experiment could be an interview. Your experiment could be naturalistic observation. Your experiment could be conducting a survey, right? Or your experiment could be conducting an experiment. I like to say that I'm conducting a study, and then I determine what type of study I am going to use in my research. If you remember, we said that with naturalistic observation, you lose a lot of control in your experiment. With experimental research, you have a lot of control in your experiment. So with experimental research, it is the investigation of a relationship between two or possibly more variables, and you are deliberately producing a change in one variable to see if it affects the second variable. So now you are trying to determine a cause and effect relationship. With experimental research, there is some sort of manipulation involved. You are manipulating one of those variables. You are deliberately trying to cause a change in one variable that will cause a change in a second variable. The advantage of using an experiment is it is the only way that psychologists can establish a cause and effect relationship. So if you want to determine a cause and effect relationship, you would do experimental research. The disadvantage is that in order for your experimental research to be valid, it needs to require careful controls. You have to control as much as you possibly can, because you have to be sure that what you did in your study caused the second variable to change. In an experiment, you actually have two types of groups. You have an experimental group and you have a control group. The treatment is the manipulation used by the experimenter. What are you manipulating? What are you changing in one variable to cause a change in the second variable? What is the treatment that you are doing? Now, the difference between the experimental group and the control group. The experimental group is the group that gets the manipulation. They are the individuals that are receiving that treatment. The control group does not get any of the treatment. The control group is used as a comparison group. You know, if you are controlling one group of individuals in your study, you need a comparison group to see how those individuals would naturally behave if they were not receiving the treatment. So the experimental group gets the manipulation, they get the treatment. The control group does not get manipulated, they do not get the treatment. So by having both an experimental group and a control group, you're able to rule out the possibility that something else actually gave you the results that you got. That's part of that validity that we talked about previously. So by controlling the treatment, you are sure that it is that treatment and nothing else that caused the change in the other group. Now, also within an experiment, you have independent and dependent variables. The independent variable, sometimes it's abbreviated IV, right? The independent variable is the variable that is manipulated. The dependent variable is the outcome of that manipulation. The outcome is expected to change as a result of the manipulation of the independent variable. So if I want to do a study looking at the amount of sleep that you get before a test can actually affect how well you do on the test. So I have participants come into the lab and I manipulate or I control how much sleep they have. One group is allowed to sleep for 3 hours that night. One group is allowed to sleep for 5 hours that night. One group is allowed to sleep for 8 hours that night. And then a fourth group, the control group, they just behave as they normally would the night before a test, right? So I am manipulating how much sleep the individuals get. So the amount of sleep is the independent variable. I'm looking at the grades they get on the test. So that would be my dependent variable. It would be the outcome of that manipulation. When we assign participants to either the experimental group or the control group, we have to be very careful about this assignment placement. And we do this by using random assignment. With random assignment, it's a procedure for which the participants are assigned to different experimental groups or conditions on the basis of chance alone. So it has to be completely unbiased. So with random assignment, I may have you draw pieces of paper out of a hat. Group 1, group 2, group 1, group 2, right? Maybe I flip a coin, heads and tails. Everyone who chose heads, you go to this group. Everyone who chose tails, you go to this group. Maybe I have you count off by ones and twos. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Everyone who got a 1, you go to this group. Everyone who had a 2, you go to this group. That is all completely random. Everyone has just an equally likely chance of getting into one group as they have of getting into another group. And this procedure is a solution to the endless list of characteristics that a group of participants can have in an experiment. You know, it would be great if I was doing an experiment on math ability and I knew that some of the participants who came in to do my research were math majors. I would love all of those math majors to be in my experimental group. That would increase the likelihood of the results of my experiment. However, that is very unethical and biased. I cannot do that. It has to be equally likely that the participants in my group are in the experimental group as they are in the control group. So random assignment is key when you are conducting an experiment. This slide is taken from Figure 2 in Module 5. That's on page 41 in your textbook. And you can see this is how a study, an experiment would be conducted. So first off, you would identify the participants. Here we're looking at primates, right? You would randomly assign your participants to a condition, right? Group 1 is the treatment group. They receive the actual drug. Group 2 is the control group. They do not receive a drug. So pharmaceutical companies use this all the time when they are studying a new drug, let's say for cancer, or a new drug for some sort of psychological disorder. They're going to identify the participants and they're going to randomly assign them to either the treatment group or the control group. They're going to then measure the dependent variables, and then they're going to compare the results of the two groups. Remember, the experimental group always gets the treatment, so they would be the group that always gets the drug in a drug study. The control group does not get the treatment. They do not get any of the drug. They would get what is called a placebo, right? A placebo is a drug that may look like the drug, smell like the drug, taste like the drug, but it's not actually the drug. Usually it is a sugar pill that is used. But you don't want your groups to know which group they are in, because that could then affect the outcome of your study. So everyone in your study has to be treated the exact same way. This is Figure 4 on page 43 in your textbook, and this is actually going back to the Latane and Darley experiment. When we were talking about in Module 4, the diffusion of responsibility, and they were hypothesizing that the more people that observed an emergency, the less likely that individual would be to get help. And so you can see in this graph that in the Latane and Darley experiment, it showed that as the size of the group witnessing an emergency increases, helping behavior actually decreases. So here, if you have 2 people observing an experiment or an emergency, the likelihood of receiving help is extremely high. You increase it to 3 people, it drops down. You increase it to 6 people, it actually drops way down. So the smaller the number of bystanders, the greater the degree of helping. Or the greater the number of bystanders, the lesser the degree of helping behavior you will actually get in your experiment. So coming back to this Latane and Darley experiment, we asked the question, were they right in their hypothesis? So we want to recall, the diffusion of responsibility theory. So in testing the hypothesis, Latane and Darley could not be sure that the results were truly meaningful unless they determined whether those results represented a significant outcome. What we mean by significant outcome is that it indicates that the findings of a research study are statistically meaningful. Whenever you go to that I in the optic R, right, that was interpretation, that is where you are analyzing your results. And as I said, in psychology, we use statistics to analyze our results. Those statistics should be statistically significant. If they are, then your hypothesis is supported. If they are not, then your hypothesis is not statistically or is not supported. So only when the differences between the groups are large enough, that statistical test shows them to be significant, and if it is possible for researchers to confirm the hypothesis. This slide is actually figure 3 in your textbook. And it just shows you the various methodologies that we had spoken about, right? The descriptive and correlational research, archival research, naturalistic observation, survey, case study, and experiments. It's going to show you the description, the advantages, and the disadvantages. So it is everything that we had just talked about in the previous slides. It just makes it more succinct in this one table or in this one figure if you wanted to use that later on as you were studying. All right, so the last slide in this module is moving beyond the study. So you've done the optic part, right? You observed, you tested, you interpreted, and you communicated your findings. This is where we come back to that R in the optic R of the scientific method. And if you remember, we said that R stood for replication. So replicated research, it is where you are repeating the research that was already conducted. Sometimes you're using other procedures, settings, or groups of participants, and it's going to then increase the confidence in those prior findings. You should be able to take a previous study that was done, and if that study was statistically significant and it supported the hypothesis, you should be able to take that study and you should be able to replicate it. And that will then give more confidence to that prior study. Replication is critical in order for full confidence about the meaning of the research studies. There have been many studies that have replicated previous research that's been done and has then failed to support the original findings. That then becomes problematic because is it what you did in your replicated study that was wrong, or was there something wrong in the original study that was done? If you cannot replicate a study, it becomes very problematic in the confidence for the outcomes of that original study. Sometimes you may do what is called a meta-analysis. A meta-analysis is where you look at a lot of previous, it's kind of like archival research in a sense, but it's where you look at a bunch of other research that's been done on a topic in order to find some sort of overall conclusion. So let's say that I'm going to conduct a research study, right? But instead of running an experiment, or instead of doing a survey, or instead of doing a correlational type of research, I'm going to collect all the previous publicated research that's been done on this topic, and I'm going to use that to find some sort of overall conclusion. That is what a meta-analysis is. You're looking at all the other research that's been done on this topic in order to find some sort of overall conclusion.